What's up, YouTube? My name is Josh, and this is Excel for Supply Chain. Today I'm going to show you how to use a pivot table and also create one. So this is a two-part series. The first is going to show you how to actually set up the data for the pivot table, and the second will show you actually how to take that and do something meaningful with it. So we're going to go over what is a pivot table, how to set up the data for it, and we're going to be able to create our first pivot table. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe using the link below. So what is a pivot table? A pivot table allows you to see data in a more organized way, and this is particularly useful for large data sets. And when I mean a large data set, I mean anywhere from 10,000 to 100,000 line items. Because, for example, if you're working for a large company, then you may have information that you pull out of your ERP system as a data dump. And you need to be able to go through and filter that data and do something meaningful with it. This also allows us to cut up our data. For example, if we have a really large data set, then we want to be able to take the data and organize it in a way that we to get only what we need. And so sometimes that's useful because the files could be quite large and our computers can't really handle it. So if we take and dissect the data into more manageable chunks, the faster our computers run and the better it is for our day-to-day. So let's go ahead and get started. First thing that we want to make sure of is that our data is set up in the correct format. Take a look at the data on the Bad Data tab. The data here has gaps, and this is not optimal for format. You want to make sure that your data is set up in a way where one row in Excel houses all the data that you'll need analysis on. So for example, row number 3 here would be a great example. So now that that's out of the way and we know how to format our data, we'll just go ahead and click on raw data here, and then we'll just see our whole entire good data set. So the first thing we're going to do is select all of the data that we want to be included in our pivot table, and then we're going to insert it into the pivot table. So we'll select the top row here, and then we can press Command Shift down on our Mac or Control Shift down on Windows, and that selected all of the data. We could click Insert and then go to Pivot Table, and this is going to bring up the Create Pivot Table dialog box. And so we're going to get a couple different options here. The first is going to ask us, which data would you like? Well, we've already selected select a table or range since we've already selected the data. If we forgot to select the data, we could easily click right here and then select the data as needed. The second thing we're going to do is make sure that New Worksheet is selected, and the reason being is we need to know where we're going to place the pivot table. I like using New Worksheet because it makes me feel warm and fuzzy inside. So we'll click OK and move on. So now you notice a few different things just happened. At the top of the ribbon, we can now see that we have the Pivot Table Analyze and the Pivot Table Design tabs here up at the top. So these tabs are both going to be useful in setting up your pivot table. So now we're going to click on the box that says Pivot Table 5. And we could do that. We're doing that just to make sure that this Pivot Table Builder dialog box is open. If it's not, we could always click Field List as well. You could click that and then bring it back up. So at the top we see field name. And so this contains all of the fields that we had in our original data. You'll see part number, inventory class, standard pack quantity, average daily use. Some of these very useful things that we could pull out of our ERP system is what we're seeing here. It's really important to note that you could turn on the field And what it's going to do is Excel's automatically going to think something for you. And so, for example, you can see where we turned on part number, and then it automatically calculated the sum total of the parts. And that's not necessarily what we want. In order to get a little bit better level of control, you could take the field and drag it to these different categories such as filters, columns, rows, and values. So for our purposes, it would be interesting if we took the data that we had and we wanted to determine which inventory buckets that these parts lie, whether it's class A, B, or C inventory. So the first step we're going to do is we're going to take inventory class and we're going to drag it down to rows. So now you see that we have row labels A, B, and C. So this isn't just useful just by itself. So let's go ahead and determine how many part numbers fit into all those classes. So let's take part number and let's drag it down to sum of values. So you see what Excel did right here is it actually added up all the A, B, and C class part numbers. And that's not particularly useful for what we're doing here. So what we're going to do is we're going to click on this info button right here. You could also click on field at the top. So we'll click on this. If you're on a Windows computer, you could right click right here, and then it's going to bring up a drop down menu, and then at the bottom you'll click field settings, and this will take you to the exact same place. So here we have our pivot table field dialog box, and this gives us some options to choose from the calculations that Excel will actually make for the field that we took and dropped down into this bucket. So it's going to be more useful for us to use count. So we'll click on count here, and then we'll press OK. Now that we've clicked OK, we could go ahead and start to drag in some of these other fields here. So for example, let's go ahead and drag in SPQ, and then ADU, and then also supplying location. We're dragging these into our row bucket here, because if we drag them into columns, you can see that it sets up the data in a pretty weird way, and this is not very helpful when you have a really large data set. It's primarily better to have the data into rows. So we'll just move this back over to rows as well. Okay, so now that we've got our data here, this really isn't very useful. We could see that the data is very organized and we could see everything really quickly, but it would be more interesting for us to have another format. So we'll click on design as we had talked about before, and then when we click on this tab, we see where we have different color options. We could change the color, and then we can also choose different ways to change the look and the feel of the data. But for our purposes, what's going to be most important is report layout. When you click on report layout, you have three different options. Show in compact form, that's how the data is already presented. You also have outline form, which shows it very similar to how you would think of an outline. Then you also have tabular form. Tabular form is going to be the way that most data should be presented. One thing that you'll notice here is that you could also turn on subtotals. So for example, if you wanted to see subtotals for each subset or subgroup, you could turn that on. You could also turn on the grand totals, and you can see this here at the bottom. But say if we wanted to turn that off, we could actually do that as well. So let's go ahead and turn off all our subtotals and grand totals. So now that we have that completed, you've already created your first pivot table. Let me show you how you could actually export this same data into another tab but not in a pivot table. So let's go ahead and select the top row here, and then what we're going to do is use Command Shift down to select all the data, but we have to keep doing it to make sure that we get all of it. So now that we've selected all of it, we could just simply use Command C or Control V or Control C on your Windows keyboard, and then we'll click on create a new tab, and then we'll paste. But we don't want to just paste, because if we just paste, then what it's going to do is just paste the pivot table. But we want to go to Paste Special and then click on Values. Then we'll click OK. And there you have it. You have all of our information in a format that we could actually use and do something with. Of course, we could do a little bit of data cleanup where we drag these down to make sure that they're all aligned with inventory class, and we could take this information and use it to VLOOKUP or use create some kind of graph with it, and now we have it in a format that we could use and export the information. So there you have it. You have now created your first pivot table. Be sure to subscribe below and check out the next video where I'll show you how to use the pivot table that you just created. Thanks for watching, guys.